He thought he would just sign the papers and leave. But when he and his son arrived at the frozen island they had inherited, they found letters in the attic and learned what their grandfather had kept secret until his death. See how a father and son restore what time and silence had almost destroyed. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The letter arrived a week after the funeral, pressed between unpaid bills and sympathy cards that had already lost their meaning. Edward Norton didn't open it right away. The envelope was thick, yellowed at the corners, stamped with the insignia of a northern notary's office. It sat on the kitchen counter for hours while the coffee cooled and the snow fell outside the apartment window in slow, lazy spirals. When he finally slid it open, the words seemed to breathe a different kind of air, old, cold, deliberate. His father, the man who had refused to speak to him for nearly a decade, had left him an island. It didn't make sense at first. His father had been a shipbuilder once, a man who could shape wood into something that floated and survived storms. But after the collapse of his small shipyard, he had disappeared north, leaving behind debts, bitterness, and a son who wanted answers. Edward had never gone after him. Now all that was left was a signature and a line of legal text. Property of the late Severin Norton, one parcel of land, situated on the northern lake of Marrow Bay. He told himself he didn't care. But that night, when his son Owen asked quietly at dinner, "What was Grandpa like?" he couldn't answer. He saw himself in the boy's eyes, 12 years old, restless, already half aware that fathers weren't invincible. The question lingered, like frost that never melts. By the next morning, he decided to go. The journey north was long and unhurried, the kind of road that demanded silence. Snow flurried against the windshield in soft sheets, erasing everything familiar. They drove for hours, stopping only for gas and bad coffee, in towns that looked the same dim lights, rusted trucks, the smell of diesel. Owen sat in the passenger seat, bundled in his jacket, chewing on a piece of bread and bacon that Edward had packed from home. The thermos between them steamed faintly, filling the car with the smell of burnt coffee. "Was he rich?" the boy asked after a while. "No," Edward said, eyes fixed on the road. "Not when I knew him." "Then why'd he buy an island?" "He built boats," Edward said. "Maybe he needed somewhere to keep them." The boy nodded, satisfied for a moment. Outside, the forests grew denser, black trunks streaking past like ribs of an ancient creature. The world seemed to fold into whiteness. As the daylight dimmed, the road narrowed, curling around the edge of a lake that appeared suddenly between the trees. A wide sheet of steel-gray ice, cracked and uneven, breathing wisps of fog into the cold air. By the time they reached the village at the water's edge, the sun had sunk low. Wooden houses leaned into the wind, their roofs buried under snow. A few men were hauling sleds by the pier, their boots crunching on ice. One of them, a bearded man with eyes as pale as the lake, walked up when Edward asked about the island. "You're heading out there now?" the man said, glancing toward the half-frozen expanse. "Ice isn't solid yet. You'll need a boat." Edward hesitated. "Can I rent one?" The man pointed to an old metal rowboat half buried in snow near the dock. "That one's for sale. $10, and it's yours. But you'll have to break through the ice yourself. Watch for the channels near the middle. They don't freeze right away." He paid without arguing. They loaded their supplies, a lantern, a small burner, cans of beans, a sack of potatoes, a pan, 2 blankets, and the letter that had started it all. The man lent them 2 life jackets that smelled of mold. "If you hear the ice singing," he warned, "row faster. Means it's breaking." The boat groaned as they pushed it into the water. A thin crust of ice cracked and folded away under the oars. The lake stretched into silence, a mixture of black water and dull white patches where the frost had thickened. Owen sat in the bow, clutching the lantern, his breath forming clouds. The sound of the oars echoed between the hills. Somewhere in the distance, a loon cried, then was swallowed by fog. Halfway across, the boy whispered, "It's like the world stopped moving." Edward smiled faintly. That's what it's supposed to feel like. They rested for a moment, letting the boat drift among the ice. The thermos passed between them, coffee for the father, hot chocolate for the son. They shared bread and bacon again, the fat stiff and cold, but familiar. The smell of it mixed with the iron scent of the lake. For a fleeting second, Edward thought of his father doing the same thing years ago. Rowing, perhaps, through this same water, in a silence not unlike this one. By the time they reached the island, dusk had become full night. The boat scraped against the shore, and the sound echoed like a broken bell. The island was small, no more than a stretch of pine and rock, rising out of the water like a forgotten piece of land. At its center stood a house, or what was left of one. The roof sagged, the windows were dark, and the door hung crookedly from its hinges. Yet the structure had a stubbornness about it, a refusal to surrender. They pulled the boat ashore and carried their things up a short path buried in snow. The air smelled of pine and smoke long gone cold. When Edward pushed open the door, the darkness inside felt thick, almost physical. Dust floated in the beam of his flashlight. There was a table, a chair, and an iron stove in the corner. The walls were bare, except for old nails and the faint outline of where pictures might have hung once. He set down the lantern, lit it, and felt the room exhale a faint warmth. "This'll do," he said quietly. Owen looked around, eyes wide. "Did Grandpa live here all alone?" "Looks like it." They unpacked the essentials. Edward found a stack of dry wood by the wall and managed to coax a small fire into the stove. Soon the sound of burning filled the silence, the soft hiss, the crackle, the occasional pop of resin. The warmth spread slowly, uncertainly, but enough to make the cold retreat to the corners. They sat close to the stove, eating straight from the canned beans heated over the flame, a few slices of bread between them. The taste was bland but comforting. Outside, the wind began to rise, pressing against the walls with a low groan. "This place is creepy," Owen said, half smiling. "Only until morning," Edward replied. "Everything looks different when there's light." Later, when the fire died down and the boy had fallen asleep under both blankets, Edward sat by the window, staring out at the lake. The moonlight caught the frozen patches, making them shimmer like glass. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the rest of his life work he no longer cared about. Debts that gnawed at him. People who wouldn't notice he was gone. Here, there was only the sound of the wind and the slow, rhythmic breath of his son. He thought of his father again, the man who had built ships but couldn't keep a family afloat, a man who had chosen isolation over reconciliation. Edward wondered what had driven him here, to this cold piece of earth in the middle of nowhere. Maybe it wasn't running away. Maybe it was holding on. When he finally crawled under the blanket beside his son, the last sound he heard before sleep was the ice shifting on the lake. Long, mournful like wood, bending under a weight it could barely carry. It was a sound both fragile and ancient. He didn't know yet that it would follow him through the nights to come, weaving into his dreams and reminding him that nothing, not even silence, stays still forever. Morning came slowly, almost unwillingly, as though the sun itself had to fight its way through the fog that clung to the island. Edward woke to the sound of the stove sighing and the faint rhythm of water dripping from the roof into a tin bucket he had placed there during the night. The fire had gone out hours ago, and the air inside the house had turned crisp again, but it was a clean kind of cold, the kind that sharpened the senses instead of numbing them. Owen was still asleep, wrapped tightly in the blanket, his small face half buried in his coat. Edward watched him for a while before rising. The boy looked at peace in a way that made him realize how rarely he'd seen him that way in the city. Maybe the noise, the rush, the bills, all of it had slowly stolen that peace without either of them noticing. He stepped outside. The world was pale and silent, the trees dusted with frost. Across the lake, the far shore was barely visible, blurred by a gray haze. The air smelled of pine and iron, and something faintly sweet, like resin. He could see the marks from their boots leading from the boat to the door, the only traces of life on the entire island. For a long moment he simply stood there, breathing it all in. There was a sense of ownership in it, not the legal kind, but something older, something bone deep. This was his father's place, and now, somehow, it was his. When Owen woke, Edward was already lighting the stove again. They ate quietly, potatoes fried in a thin layer of oil, the last of the bread toasted on the iron plate. The smell filled the room, warm and familiar. It wasn't much, but Owen grinned as though it were a feast. "It tastes better here," he said, and Edward couldn't help but agree. They spoke little. There was a natural rhythm forming between them, a kind of unspoken teamwork. After breakfast, they began to explore the house. Most of the rooms were empty. The floorboards creaked like old ships, the walls carried faint water stains, and in one corner, a pile of tools rested beneath a sheet of dust hammers, chisels, saws, each carefully arranged, as if waiting for the next day's work that never came. In the back, behind a crooked door, they found a narrow staircase that led up to a small attic. It smelled of cedar and dust. The window was cracked, its glass fogged from years of neglect. A single beam of light fell across the floor, illuminating a stack of wooden boxes tied with twine. Edward knelt and opened the first one. Inside were papers, sketches, and folded blueprints, intricate lines drawn in steady, deliberate strokes. He unrolled one across the floor. It wasn't a ship, it was a house, but not like any house he had seen before. Its walls were curved inward slightly, like the hull of a boat turned upside down. Every beam and angle seemed designed to resist something, to yield to the wind rather than break against it. At the bottom of the page, in his father's handwriting, were the words, "A house that can weather any storm." Owen crouched beside him. "Did Grandpa build it?" Edward didn't answer right away. He traced the ink lines with his fingers. Maybe he tried. In another box, they found letters, yellowed with age, each addressed to him but never sent. The first began simply, "If you're reading this, it means the house stood longer than I did." Edward sat back, the weight of the words sinking into him. His father had written these knowing he might never speak to him again. He had built something not just from wood, but from guilt, regret, and hope. He read until the words blurred. The boy sat quietly, sensing that the discovery meant something too deep to interrupt. That evening, they worked on sealing the windows and patching the gaps in the roof. The house felt fragile, like an old body trying to heal itself, but Edward saw potential in it. Every nail he hammered, every board he fixed, felt like a conversation with the past. When the light faded, they lit the lantern and sat by the stove. For dinner, they made potato soup using the last of the vegetables and a small piece of fish they had bought in the village. The steam rose from the pot, and the smell of salt and herbs filled the room. Owen watched his father ladle it into 2 bowls, his eyes glowing in the flickering light. "It's good," the boy said after a spoonful. "Tastes like the lake." Edward smiled. That's because it came from it. It was a simple thing, hot soup on a cold night, but it bound them together more tightly than any words could. After they ate, Owen drew small figures with his finger on the fogged window, while Edward read more letters. One spoke of a dream his father had carried for years, to build a place where silence could live, where a man could listen to the wind and remember that he was part of something larger than himself. The old man had called it the House for the Wind. He had written, "If you ever come here, you'll see that it's not finished." I ran out of strength before I ran out of wood. That night, Edward dreamed of hammer blows echoing through snow, of a man bent over a workbench with frost in his beard. When he woke, the fire had died again, and faint daylight was seeping through the cracks. Owen was still asleep, the blanket pulled over his head. Outside, the wind had picked up. It moaned around the corners of the house, pressing at the walls like an impatient visitor. Edward rose quietly and stepped outside. The lake was almost entirely frozen now, smooth and glassy near the shore, but fractured farther out, like a mosaic of shifting mirrors. The sky was heavy with gray. He imagined his father standing here years ago, watching the same scene, listening to the same sounds. Maybe that was what had drawn him north in the first place. Not solitude, but honesty. The kind of truth that only comes when everything else has been stripped away. When he went back inside, Owen was awake, sitting by the stove, poking at the embers. "Can we fix it?" he asked. "The house, I mean." Edward looked around the patched walls, the sagging ceiling, the blueprint now spread across the table. "We can try," he said, "but we'll have to do it right." They began that day. Edward measured the beams according to the drawings, marking the angles with pencil and string. Owen carried pieces of wood from the pile outside, humming under his breath. The air inside soon filled with the smell of sawdust and smoke. They worked until their fingers stiffened, until their breaths came out in visible puffs. When hunger finally stopped them, they cooked again, this time frying thin pieces of fish in oil, adding a few slices of potato on the side. The meal was plain, but it felt earned. Owen laughed as he burned his tongue on a piece too hot to eat. Edward laughed too, surprising himself with how natural it sounded. That evening, after they'd cleared the table, Owen found a box of small wooden carvings birds, mostly, though one looked like a miniature boat. "Grandpa made these," he said, running a finger along the tiny hull. "He was good." "He was," Edward said softly, "better than I gave him credit for." Later, when the wind rose again and the stove glowed red, Owen crawled closer to his father. "Why did he stay here alone?" he asked. Edward stared into the fire for a long time before answering. Maybe he wasn't alone. Maybe this place was enough. The boy thought about that, then nodded, satisfied. He fell asleep soon after, his head resting on his father's shoulder. Edward stayed awake, reading one more letter. It was short, just a few lines. "If you ever build something of your own, don't make it perfect. Leave one flaw. That way, the wind can pass through and not destroy it." Outside, the lake groaned again, deep and low. He looked toward the window, where snow was beginning to drift across the glass. The sound reminded him of Breathsteady, alive. For the first time since they had arrived, the house didn't feel like a ruin. It felt like something waiting to be finished. Over the next days, they fell into a rhythm. Mornings began with gathering wood, midday with repairs, evenings with food, and stories told in fragments. Owen grew more confident, handling tools with curiosity and care. He caught fish through a small hole in the ice, cheering when he pulled the line up with a flash of silver. They cooked it with onions and salt, the skin crisping beautifully over the pan. Edward found himself teaching, explaining, laughing. In the quiet between tasks, he caught himself humming old tunes he didn't know he remembered. Every night before sleeping, he read another of the letters. They revealed not only the blueprints of a house, but of a man. Regret intertwined with love, stubbornness softened by time. He realized that the silence between them hadn't been heart, it had been pride and fear, and the slow erosion of two men too alike to reach across the distance. Here, on this island, surrounded by wind and ice, that distance was finally closing. One evening, while clearing a shelf near the back of the room, Edward found an old photograph wedged behind a jar of nails. It showed a younger version of himself, 10 years old, standing beside his father on a half-built boat. His father's handwriting was scrawled on the back. "If he ever returns, tell him I didn't leave. I was just waiting." The words hit harder than he expected. He sat for a long time, the photograph trembling slightly in his hands, until Owen came and leaned against him without saying a word. They sat that way until the fire dimmed, and the cold pressed gently against the walls again. When Edward finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "He wasn't building a house for himself," he said. "He was building it for us." Owen didn't answer, but his small hand slipped into his father's, warm and sure. Outside, the lake creaked and shifted. The ice was changing, tightening under the night air. The wind circled the island, whistling softly through the cracks in the roof, not as an intruder anymore, but as part of the house itself. And Edward understood what the old man had meant all along. A house for the wind was a house for everything that could not be controlled, only respected. He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of the gusts outside, to the faint crackling of embers. The sound no longer spoke of loneliness, but of life continuing. Tomorrow they would finish the roof, and after that, maybe the walls. There was work to do, and the winter was far from over. But for the first time in years, he felt certain that they were building something that would last. The days had grown shorter, and the light that once filled the house now lingered only a few hours each morning before fading into the gray weight of afternoon. The island was almost entirely wrapped in ice. From the window, the lake looked like a vast sheet of broken glass, its cracks spreading in long, elegant lines that shimmered under the pale sun. The air was sharper, too, the kind that cut through wool and stung the lungs when breathed too deeply. Yet inside the house, warmth had begun to live again, not just from the stove, but from something quieter, steadier. The repairs had held. The roof no longer leaked, the walls no longer sighed in the wind, and the space that once felt hollow now hummed softly with human presence. Edward had stopped counting the days. He didn't know if it had been 2 weeks or a month since they'd arrived, but time had lost its usual grip here. Life had found a slower rhythm. Wake with the cold light, gather wood, fix what was still broken, cook, talk, rest. The kind of rhythm that leaves room for silence without letting it turn into emptiness. That morning began like any other. The stove had burned out during the night, and Edward woke to the faint blue of dawn seeping through the frosted window. Owen was already up, kneeling by the bucket near the door, breaking the thin crust of ice that had formed on its surface. He looked up when his father stirred. "It froze again," he said, smiling with that quiet pride that comes from solving small problems. Edward sat up and rubbed his face, feeling the stiffness in his shoulders, the satisfying ache of work well done. "That means we're still alive," he said, and Owen laughed softly, echoing his father's humor as he poured the water into the kettle. They ate fried bread and a little honey that morning. The sweetness clung to the edges of the smoke in the air. Outside, the world was motionless. Even the birds had stopped crossing the sky. The only sound was the wind brushing against the boards of the house, like a slow, steady hand testing its strength. After breakfast, they went outside to check the beams near the south wall, where the snow had piled thick during the last storm. Edward noticed how the house looked now sturdy, patched, alive. It wasn't beautiful in the way buildings in the city were. It was rough, uneven, but honest. He found that he loved it for those flaws. His father had written once, "Leave one flaw so the wind can pass through," and now he understood. The imperfection made it real, made it breathe. Owen carried a bucket of wood back inside, humming tunelessly. He had begun to move through the house like someone who belonged to it, not like a guest. That realization made Edward's chest tighten with something between pride and melancholy. For years, he had lived surrounded by walls that didn't feel like his own. Mortgage payments, rent, repairs he couldn't afford. Those were the houses he had known. But this place, this broken inheritance from a man he had resented, was the first that had started to feel like home. The peace of the day held until mid-afternoon, when the sound of an engine shattered the stillness. At first, it was distant, a faint, irregular growl that seemed to come from beneath the frozen lake itself. Edward stepped outside, shading his eyes against the low sun. Across the ice, a dark figure was approaching, gliding fast. A snowmobile. It moved with purpose, cutting through the frozen expanse, leaving a trail of powdered snow behind it. Owen came to the doorway. "Dad?" he asked. Edward didn't answer. He waited, watching the machine draw closer until he could make out the man riding it tall, broad, wrapped in a fur-lined coat. When the snowmobile reached the shore, the man dismounted and raised a hand in greeting that was more a gesture of ownership than respect. "Mr. Norton?" the man called. His voice carried easily across the cold air. "You've made quite a trip." Edward felt the old instincts of city life return, the cautious politeness, the guarded curiosity. "That's right," he said. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, the kind of smile meant for negotiations. "Name's Carver. I run Northern Estates. You might have heard of us." He brushed snow from his gloves. "I was the one trying to buy this land a few years back, from your father." Edward's jaw tightened. "I know who you are." Carver seemed pleased by that. "Then maybe we can finish what your father started refusing. I'll be direct. We still want this island. We're planning a set of private cabins here next summer. I can make you an offer that'll take care of you and your boy for a long time." He reached into his coat, pulling out a folder that looked absurdly clean against the landscape. "You won't have to lift another hammer, I promise." Owen had stepped closer, his gloved hand clutching his father's sleeve. Edward glanced down at him, then back at the man. "It's not for sale," he said quietly. Carver chuckled. "Everyone says that at first. But I'm offering more than money. I'm offering relief. You think this place will last forever? Look around. It's falling apart. You've got a kid. You want him living on a pile of frozen wood? Take the deal. Start over somewhere warm." Edward said nothing. The man's words echoed inside him, stirring something practical and uneasy. Warmth, security, a future for his son. They were things he had always wanted. Carver must have seen the hesitation because his tone softened, almost kindly. "It's what any good father would do," he said. "Sell what's left of the past to build something new." That line cut deep. Edward didn't answer. He only said, "Come back tomorrow." The man looked surprised but nodded. "Think about it," he said, and within moments the engine roared back to life, fading across the ice until the sound vanished into the wind. For a long while, Edward stood there, watching the horizon. The lake gleamed faintly, a brittle mirror of sky and shadow. He could feel Owen's eyes on him. "Are you going to sell it?" the boy asked finally. His voice was small but steady. Edward turned toward him, searching for the right words. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe I should." He saw the disappointment flicker in his son's expression before the boy turned away and went back inside without another word. That evening, the silence between them was heavier than it had ever been. The fire burned strong, but neither of them spoke. Edward stared into the flames, his mind circling the same questions. What was he holding on to? An old man's dream? A ruin? The logical part of him knew what to do. Take the money, leave before spring, rebuild a life somewhere that didn't smell of ash and ghosts. But another part, the one he'd been trying to ignore, knew that something sacred would die if he did. He thought of the blueprint, of the curved walls meant to yield instead of resist. His father hadn't built a house to fight the wind. He had built it to live with it. Owen broke the silence at last. "You always told me things matter more when you build them yourself," he said quietly, not looking up from the floor. Edward felt the words strike deeper than any argument could. He watched his son for a long time, then reached for the kettle. "Come here," he said. They made coffee together, real coffee, not the weak, reheated kind they'd been drinking. The smell filled the house, dark and rich. Edward took out the last bit of honey, spread it on the fried bread, and handed a piece to Owen. The boy smiled faintly, but still looked uncertain. "So what are we going to do?" he asked. Edward took a slow sip before answering. "We're going to stay, at least until the thaw. Maybe longer." The decision didn't feel like a declaration, more like an acknowledgement of something that had already been decided. Outside, the wind had quieted, as if listening. The night stretched on, full of small sounds, the hiss of the fire, the creak of settling wood, the faint breath of the lake beneath the ice. Edward thought of his father's last letter. "The house stands when a man remembers why he built it." He set his cup down and looked around at the room, the walls, the tools, the signs of their labor. It wasn't wealth, it wasn't safety, but it was something that held them upright. The next morning, Carver returned. He didn't waste time with greetings. "Well," he asked, "do we have a deal?" Edward stepped outside, the cold biting into his cheeks. Owen stood behind him, watching. The man's voice was confident, rehearsed. He began listing numbers, figures that might have dazzled another listener. But Edward wasn't listening to the man. He was listening to the island, the faint whisper of wind through the trees, the slow creak of ice shifting, the heartbeat of the place that had somehow become his. When Carver finished, Edward simply said, "No." The man blinked. "No? You heard me." Carver sighed, frustration breaking through his smile. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," Edward said, "but it's mine to make." The investor looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You'll regret this," he said, and without another word, he climbed onto the snowmobile. The engine screamed to life, then dwindled into the distance, leaving only the tracks cutting across the ice-clean, precise, temporary. Edward watched until the horizon swallowed the sound. The air was clear again. The sun caught the snow, scattering light like shards of glass. He felt no triumph, only calm. When he turned back toward the house, Owen was smiling. "What now?" the boy asked. "Now we build," Edward said. "The wind will want to know if we're serious." They spent the rest of the day reinforcing the foundation and clearing snow from the roof. By dusk, they were exhausted, their hands raw, their faces flushed from the cold. Dinner was simple fish, bread, and water melted from snow, but it tasted better than anything they'd eaten in months. They sat by the fire, listening to the ice crackle and reform outside. The world beyond the island no longer seemed pressing. There were no deadlines, no debts, only this: father and son, warmth and effort, the soft breath of survival. As night deepened, Edward stepped outside once more. The wind had changed direction, carrying a hint of thaw. Across the lake, the horizon glowed faintly with the promise of another dawn. He thought of his father's hands shaping wood, of his own son's laughter, of the long chain of men building something not perfect, but enduring. He whispered into the cold, "The house for the wind will stand." Behind him, the door creaked open, and Owen's voice called softly, "Come inside, Dad. It's getting colder." Edward turned, smiling at the sight of his son framed by the warm glow of the lantern. He walked back toward him, leaving only footprints in the snow. The wind swept gently over them, tracing the marks but not erasing them completely. For now, the lake slept, the island breathed, and the house held its ground against the endless whispering air. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Watch the next video and explore the others waiting for you on the channel. And if you know someone who would feel this story too, share this video with them. Some stories are meant to be passed on.